Is this real? That's what millions of viewers whispered as they watched the 9-second video burning through every corner of the internet. A flight attendant, a sharp slap, a man in a gray suit, eyes stunned, head turning slightly from impact. Then silence. The clip had no caption, just shaky camera footage and the sound of someone gasping off screen. Within an hour, hashtags exploded. Who is he? Slapgate, #SkyNova incident. And then, President Slap. Tell us where you're watching from. Would you have recognized him before the slap? 10 minutes earlier, Noi Bai International Airport. A SkyNova aircraft had just landed under light drizzle and heavy protocol. First-class passengers were expected to disembark one by one, cameras ready. The French delegation's arrival was being streamed live by 2 major outlets. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped into the jet bridge. No entourage, just a simple carry-on and diplomatic badge tucked inside his coat. That's when the young flight attendant blocked his path. Her eyes scanned him from shoes to collar, unimpressed. "You lost?" she asked, voice flat. He gently shook his head, raising his hand to present identification. She didn't look. Instead, she snapped, "You people always think you can walk into first class like you own it." And then, a loud, stinging slap. Gasps echoed from crew and nearby passengers. Cameras clicked. A French cameraman cursed under his breath. The man didn't say a word. He adjusted his cufflinks, nodded slightly, and walked off the ramp. No one, not even the Prime Minister of Vietnam waiting at the diplomatic gate, realized what had just happened. But 5 minutes later, over $4.7 billion in airline credit would freeze, 87 flights would be grounded, and one airline CEO would be packing a bag. The man they thought they humiliated? He was the president of France, and this was his opening move. The French president didn't travel like other world leaders. No entourage, no fanfare, just a low-profile diplomatic badge and a habit of watching before acting. Laurent Béchet had always believed that power didn't need to shout. It simply arrived. Born in Marseille, raised by a seamstress mother and a quiet schoolteacher father, Béchet grew up watching how systems treated people who didn't look like they belonged. He noticed early that dignity wasn't handed out. It had to be protected. That belief shaped his rise. From economics professor to finance minister, he avoided the spotlight, but quietly restructured half of France's international debt strategy. And when a political scandal rocked the previous administration, Béchet, clean, calm, and calculating, was the compromise candidate everyone underestimated. They didn't know the man behind the glasses had built a silent empire of influence, especially inside the European financial system, especially in aviation. Back on the ground in Hanoi, as security scrambled and whispers turned into full-blown panic, Béchet walked calmly through the terminal. He knew what was about to happen. 6 months earlier, he'd orchestrated the silent acquisition of 49% of SkyNova Airlines through a web of sovereign investment vehicles. He wasn't just visiting Vietnam. He was inspecting his new asset. The slap? That wasn't a disruption. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the industry still didn't get it, that people still judged by skin tone, accent, and presence, or lack of it. So when he reached the car waiting outside, Béchet didn't even sit before pulling out a secure device from his coat. Just one button. No password needed. A single signal went out. In Brussels, a dashboard turned red. In Singapore, a routing table froze. And in Paris, someone's phone rang and didn't stop. Béchet didn't blink. He just whispered to himself, "Game on." Lynn Morgan had only been promoted to lead cabin crew 6 weeks earlier. Fresh-faced, sharp-tongued, and ambitious, she'd quickly gained a reputation at SkyNova for running a tight ship and making snap judgments. Her motto? Don't let anyone walk where they haven't earned the right. And today, she thought she was proving it. When the man in the gray suit stepped off the plane without flashing a SkyNova elite badge, she didn't pause. His demeanor didn't match what she expected of a first-class passenger. No assistant, no Rolex, just quiet confidence. To Linh, that confidence looked like arrogance. "You lost?" she said, stepping in his path. He reached into his coat for a diplomatic pass. She didn't even glance. That's when it happened. A slap meant to enforce authority, but delivered to the wrong man in the worst place at the worst possible time. Back in the cabin, junior flight attendants stood frozen. One whispered, "I think that was the French president." "No way," another muttered. "Why would he be flying alone?" But the silence in the air said otherwise. Everyone felt it. The shift, the mistake, the consequences slowly beginning to unroll like a dropped spool of wire. Minutes later, the captain got the call. His face drained of color. He didn't tell the crew much, just enough. "Lock the cockpit, hold position, corporate will be in touch." Linh tried to ask what was going on, but no one answered. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was now small. For the first time, she looked back at the passenger she'd struck and realized he hadn't even looked at her once since. He didn't need to, because somewhere out there, far above her pay grade, someone had already started to count the cost of her mistake. And that cost? It wasn't just her job. It was billions. The footage looped on every screen in the SkyNova control room. No one said a word. Executives in suits stood frozen, eyes locked on the slap, replayed again and again, frame by frame. One legal advisor dropped her pen. Another reached for his phone, only to be told, "Don't, just watch." In Hanoi, the French press had gone silent. Not because they didn't recognize the man, but because they did. Laurent Béchet, President of France, had been struck across the face and had said nothing. At SkyNova's Paris headquarters, the first real panic hit at 4:13 p.m. local time. A blinking red alert appeared on the internal finance terminal. UIB credit status frozen. Executive code 47B. Someone gasped. "Wait, that's the emergency clause." Clause 47B. Only one man had access to it. And that man had just been slapped in front of the entire aviation world. Meanwhile, in the lounge at Noi Bai, Béchet sat alone with a cup of tea. Calm. Almost serene. The kind of calm that made people nervous. He scrolled quietly through headlines on his phone. SkyNova CEO silent on viral incident. President Béchet refuses to comment. 4.7B in airline credit under sudden review. Behind the scenes, officials from the EU, Vietnam, and SkyNova scrambled for statements, for explanations, for anything that would stop the bleeding. But Béchet? He said nothing. Because power, real power, doesn't raise its voice. Back in the crew room, Lynn Morgan sat alone. Her supervisor had stopped making eye contact. The cabin crew avoided her like she was contagious. No one told her what was happening. No one needed to. The silence spoke loudest. She played the video for the first time on her phone, watched herself slap him, watched the stillness in his eyes, watched him walk away without a word. And for the first time she realized he didn't need to look back, because everyone else in the world already was. At 4:19 p.m. Brussels time, the alert moved from yellow to red. In the heart of the European financial system, UIB's high-risk compliance desk lit up. One terminal buzzed, then another. Inside a temperature-controlled room 3 floors underground, a blinking line of code read, "Executive priority, initiate freeze, SkyNova credit line, 4.7 BUE." In Singapore, a SkyNova regional manager got the call mid-meeting. He stood, left his presentation behind. He didn't come back. In Toronto, 2 hedge fund partners hit pause on a $300 million secondary buy-in. One whispered, "Pull out before it hits the wires." Back in Paris, the CEO of SkyNova, François Duval, was boarding a train to Brussels when he got a direct message. Landline only. Urgent. His assistant's face turned white. "Sir, it's coming from the presidential office. Not ours. Theirs." Duval didn't ask questions. He stepped off the train before it moved. Within 12 minutes, over 87 flights were delayed. Terminals scrambled. Automated check-in systems glitched. The reason? Pending financing review. Of course, no airline executive would say it out loud, but everyone in the room knew the president of France had made a move, and it was working. In a quiet hotel suite in Hanoi, Béchet placed the secure device back into his coat pocket. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked out the window. "Sometimes," he muttered, "you don't slap back. You just remove the ground beneath them." In the background, breaking news alerts flashed across screens worldwide. French president involved in SkyNova disruption, 4.7 B in aviation credit suspended overnight. Who really controls the skies? And for the first time in years, the world paused, not because someone raised their voice, but because one man didn't have to. By morning, the cracks had become canyons. SkyNova's stock dropped 11% within the first hour of trading. News anchors across Europe fumbled through breaking headlines. Analysts tried to downplay it. Temporary freeze, minor credit review. But no one was buying it, because behind the scenes, every funding partner had gone quiet. In Frankfurt, a boardroom full of risk officers from the Bank of Central Europe sat staring at one number, $4.7 billion, frozen, with no release date. One whispered, "Is it retaliation?" Another replied, "It's not retaliation, it's regulation. The old kind. The kind no one sees coming." François Duval, SkyNova's CEO, was no longer giving interviews. He was in emergency meetings, one after another, chasing capital that was evaporating by the hour. His advisors floated excuses. We could blame a cybersecurity glitch, or say it was unrelated to the incident. But Duval knew better. "This isn't about the slap," he said quietly. "It's about what that slap represented." On social media, #SkyNova boycott began trending. Someone leaked the footage of Lynn Morgan's slap from a second angle. Clearer, slower, colder. Public opinion flipped fast. The internet didn't just call it a mistake anymore. They called it a symbol. At EU headquarters in Brussels, 3 commissioners met behind closed doors. "He triggered Clause 47B himself?" "Yes. As the executive sponsor of the airline fund, he has full authority. And he used it, without a press release?" One of them leaned back and sighed. "This is Béchet. He doesn't play public games. He resets the board." At Neuilly, the tarmac was quiet again. The cameras were gone. But inside a dark control room, one monitor still showed a paused frame of the slap. President Béchet mid-step, face turned, calm as stone. SkyNova thought they could walk away from it. They were wrong. By the second day, it was no longer just a viral clip. It was a diplomatic earthquake. CNN opened their morning broadcast with a split-screen left, the freeze notice from UIB with the 4.7B line item circled in red. Right, the infamous still frame. President Laurent Béchet, mid-turn, as Lynn Morgan's hand followed through. The caption, "The slap that shook Europe." At the BBC, analysts scrambled to explain how a single man, a head of state, could trigger such a catastrophic financial reaction without even issuing a formal statement. "What we're witnessing," one senior anchor said, "isn't just political. It's structural. It's systemic." The public wanted answers. And finally, they got one. Le Monde broke the exclusive. A former SkyNova board member, under condition of anonymity, confirmed what many had suspected. President Béchet isn't just an observer. He's the architect. He was behind the quiet acquisition of 49% of SkyNova through the Sovereign Stability Fund of France. He's not reacting. He's correcting. That article dropped like a hammer. Social media turned explosive. Hashtags evolved. Slapgate. SkyNova scandal. Hatched president moves. Silently, one TikTok video with 18 million views showed clips of Béchet at past summits, standing silently as others argued, watching from the edge, always calculating. The top comment read, "Y'all really slapped the guy who literally funds the air you fly through." In Hanoi, the French press corps remained tight-lipped, but word leaked that Béchet had declined all interview requests. He continued his scheduled meetings as if nothing had happened. His silence said more than words ever could. Meanwhile, Lynn Morgan's name and face were everywhere. She deactivated her social accounts. Her friends stopped texting. One anonymous blog post, allegedly from a SkyNova pilot, read, "She didn't just slap a man. She slapped a system that had been waiting for an excuse to reset itself." By the end of day 2, the New York Times ran the headline, "President Béchet didn't speak. He executed." Inside the article, a quote from an EU economic official stood out. "He didn't retaliate emotionally. He applied structural leverage. He didn't just freeze money. He froze their future." Across breakfast tables in Paris, London, and Brussels, people weren't asking why Béchet acted that way. They were asking how long he'd been planning it, because the more they looked back at the footage, the more they realized something chilling. He never looked surprised. He looked ready. 3 days after the slap, an internal memo leaked from the Ministry of Finance in Paris. The document, marked confidentiel, wasn't supposed to see daylight, but once it did, the headlines wrote themselves. Laurent Béchet wasn't just the president of France. He was also the sole executive trustee of a sovereign investment vehicle called Veritas Holdings. And Veritas had a very specific portfolio. 49% equity stake in SkyNova Airlines preferred credit rights with 6 major aviation lenders, silent controlling interest in the compliance division of UIB. In short, he owned the leash, and SkyNova had just yanked it. At that point, the media firestorm turned nuclear. One French senator was caught on a hot mic muttering, "The president didn't retaliate. He executed a pre-written playbook." The New York Times updated their headline, "France's silent CEO." Behind closed doors, SkyNova's remaining board convened a crisis session. Legal counsel warned them, "He's not violating protocol. You signed the rights away 2 quarters ago. You gave him the trigger." "How?" one board member snapped. "We never gave him executive override." "You did," the lawyer said flatly. "You just didn't know it was him." Meanwhile, in Geneva, preparations were underway for a global aviation summit. Unconfirmed reports said Béchet had requested the final keynote slot. The topic? Flight justice, rebuilding trust in the skies. No one dared question it. In the halls of Brussels, EU regulators began scrubbing records of past deals, trying to track how long Béchet had been involved, how many decision points he'd influenced quietly behind the curtain. The answer was unsettling. He'd been building leverage for 3 years. Back at Neuilly, the SkyNova lounge was reopened, but emptier than ever. A new crew had flown in. Lynn Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Some said she was on indefinite leave. Others whispered she'd been invited to join a mandatory compliance program in Paris. But the truth? She was already in Paris, sitting in a plain room inside Veritas HQ, watching her own clip on a loop. No one yelled at her. No one scolded her. They just let her watch. Until she understood. The world now saw the slap for what it was. Not just a mistake, not just a PR disaster, but a trigger. For a man who didn't need to speak to change everything. And Laurent Béchet, he hadn't finished yet. The press expected fire when the Élysée Palace announced a rare public address from President Béchet, his first since the SkyNova incident. Networks cleared primetime slots. Commentators predicted a cold reprimand, maybe even a legal maneuver, but no one expected what actually happened. The room was packed. Journalists elbowed for position. cameras clicked. Behind the podium, the presidential seal gleamed under soft light. Béchet stepped up, not with fury, but with calm. Crisp suit. No teleprompter. He began with 4 words. "I will not retaliate." The room froze. "I have no interest in embarrassing a crew member," he continued. "Shame fixes nothing. Structure does." Then he pulled out a white folder and opened it. Inside was the first draft of what would soon be known as the Flight Justice Charter, a new international protocol for passenger dignity, cabin ethics, and corporate transparency. Highlights included mandatory bias training for all flight crews funded by receiving states, independent passenger oversight panels for all EU-subsidized airlines, a universal rating system called the Flight Morality Index, FMI, scored by a combination of passenger reviews, recorded behavior, and internal accountability. And the most striking detail? SkyNova would be the pilot program, whether they liked it or not. But it didn't stop there. Béchet paused, then said, "There's still one person this nation expects me to punish." The crowd held its breath. On the large screen behind him, a live video began. Lynn Morgan appeared, seated alone in a neutral-toned interview room. She looked different, still sharp but subdued. Her hair was pulled back, her posture straight but humbled. She didn't speak at first. Then she looked up at the camera and said, "I didn't know who he was, but that's not the point, is it?" She took a breath. "I thought I was protecting a standard, but what I did, it exposed one." There was no script, no excuse, just ownership. She paused, eyes steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to rebuild the very thing I broke." Béchet stepped aside. The room remained silent. Then he said, "She will not be fired. She will be the first trainee of the program she inspired." A murmur spread through the press. He finished, "True reform isn't built on removing people. It's built on including those who are ready to change." The speech went viral in less than 10 minutes. Hashtags flooded in. #Flight Justice, #Include to Reform. Béchet didn't blink. One user posted, "He rewrote the rules. With one call, one charter, and no shouting." Another wrote, "Would you have done what he did? Or would you have demanded her job? What about you? Tell us below. Would you give her a second chance? Or is accountability something else entirely?" But Béchet didn't wait for applause. He handed the folder to the EU ambassador, turned from the cameras, and exited through the side door, quiet as ever. Because for him, this wasn't about being seen. It was about being followed. 2 weeks later, SkyNova was gone. Not collapsed, rebranded. In a sleek press event in Geneva, under a soft blue spotlight and no dramatic music, the airline unveiled its new identity. Égalité Air, where dignity takes off. No flashy speeches, no stunt announcements. Just a single statement from the new interim board. "We failed at 35,000 feet. We won't fail again on the ground." Every aircraft would now carry a new decal beside the boarding door. Certified by FMI, Flight Morality Index. That symbol wasn't decorative. It meant something. It meant crews would be retrained under the Béchet framework, led by cultural intelligence advisors. All interactions flagged by AI-assisted cabin logs would be reviewed within 48 hours by an ethics panel. Passengers, regardless of class, could report misconduct through an independent channel monitored by FMI evaluators, not the airline itself. The system was designed not to punish, but to prevent. Inside training centers across Europe, old safety manuals were shredded. A new generation of flight crews began orientation with a phrase printed on page 1. "Your uniform does not determine who belongs here. Your behavior does." And the first person to read those words aloud in class? Lynn Morgan, no longer a chief attendant, no longer trying to prove she belonged. She stood at the back of the room, this time as a student, and a reminder, not of what went wrong, but of what had to change. Outside the training center, a passerby snapped a photo of the new logo being placed on an Égalité jet. They captioned it, "The airline that got slapped, then stood back up." No applause, no PR spin, just quiet reform. Exactly how Béchet wanted it. Geneva had never felt so quiet. Inside the marble-floored conference hall of the International Civil Aviation Summit, representatives from over 40 countries sat in rows, neatly pressed suits, tightly clasped briefcases, eyes fixed forward. Everyone had come expecting turbulence, but what they got was clarity. Laurent Béchet stood at the podium in a dark gray suit. No notes, no entourage, no dramatics. He looked around the room like a teacher waiting for the class to settle. Then he spoke. Aviation is not just technology. It is humanity in motion. He spoke for exactly 14 minutes. In that time, he didn't mention Lynn Morgan. He didn't mention the slap. He didn't even say the name SkyNova. What he did was something bigger. He introduced the Flight Justice Index, a global scoring system that would measure an airline's moral performance with the same rigor it measured safety and fuel efficiency. 3 pillars held it up. Respect, how well crew and staff treat passengers across all classes. Responsiveness, how transparently airlines handle reports of misconduct. Reform, whether the airline uses incidents to improve, not conceal. Every airline would be scored quarterly. Those who met the benchmark earned FMI certification. Those who didn't would lose access to EU-subsidized credit lines and be flagged in all government contracts. Gasps rippled through the room. This wasn't just a speech. It was a line in the sand. One executive from a US carrier leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "Is he serious?" The reply, "He doesn't bluff. You saw what happened with SkyNova." When Béchet finished, he didn't stay for a Q&A. He stepped down, nodded to the moderators, and walked straight out the side exit. But the impact stayed. That afternoon, 11 airlines signed preliminary agreements to adopt the index. By evening, the number was up to 19. Reuters dubbed it the silent reform heard around the world. In the hallway outside the chamber, one young policy aide clutched the printed charter and said, "I thought we were here to discuss carbon offset goals." Another replied, "We are, but what good's a clean sky if it's filled with dirty power?" For the first time, aviation wasn't just about where planes flew. It was about how people were treated once they were inside. And thanks to Béchet, the skies had rules again. 1 year later, the footage still played in training rooms, not as punishment, as a beginning. Inside a modern auditorium in Berlin, a TEDx banner hung over the stage. Rows of airline executives, young crew trainees, and regulators filled the seats. On stage stood a familiar figure, shoulders back, voice steady. Lynn Morgan. She no longer wore the uniform. Today, she wore a slate gray blouse, no jewelry, no script. She took a breath. "I slapped the President of France." And he didn't slap back. He rewrote the rules I didn't even know I was breaking. The crowd stayed silent, not out of judgment, but respect. This story could have ended in shame. Instead, it began a charter, and it changed me. It made me understand the air we fly through isn't just physical. It's ethical. Halfway across the world, at a quiet cafe in Marseille, Laurent Béchet sat alone with a folded newspaper beside his cup. The headline read, "Former President Béchet declines second term. Time to make room." He hadn't said much since Geneva. No press tours, no memoirs. He left office as quietly as he arrived. Égalité Air was now the highest-rated airline under the Flight Morality Index, scoring 9.6 out of 10 for 4 consecutive quarters. The phrase, FMI certified, had become more than a sticker. It was a seal of trust. Other industries had begun copying it. Hospitality, retail, public transport. What started with a slap became a standard. At the annual FMI summit, someone asked Béchet what he'd say to the people who thought he'd gone too far. He smiled faintly and said, "I didn't go far. I went deep. Into the parts of a system we thought were normal." And yet, the most viewed video of the year wasn't from a summit or a press conference. It was a quiet 43-second clip. Lynn Morgan exiting a plane as a passenger, walking past a younger attendant who smiled and nodded gently. She nodded back. Nothing dramatic. But in the comments section, someone wrote, "Poetic justice isn't loud. It lands like a plane, soft, heavy, and undeniable." Across airports in 22 countries, digital banners now greet travelers with one simple phrase: "The skies are watching, so are we." And as for the man who once stood still after being slapped, he's rarely seen now. Some say he's helping draft similar frameworks for public education. Others say he's just walking more these days. No motorcade, no spotlight. Just another man in a gray coat, somewhere near the edge of a crowd. Still listening, still watching, still moving systems, one quiet shift at a time. Because in the end, that slap wasn't the climax. It was the catalyst. And Laurent Béchet, he never needed revenge. He just needed the world to finally pay attention. Thank you for flying with us. The skies are a little more just now. What would you have done in his place? Would you have stayed silent like Béchet, or demanded justice out loud? And what about Lynn? Do you believe in second chances when they're earned? Or do some mistakes define you forever? Tell us where you're watching from and how you would have rewritten this story. Because here at Telltales, we believe in stories that don't just end, they echo.